Beautiful Valencia. This is Spain's third largest city, and I've been here several times now. The first time was with my dad about 20 years ago. How time flies. From that trip, I remember walking along my first European beach, seeing more toplessness in half an hour than most guys from the Arizona desert see in a lifetime. It was eye-opening. But when I called my girlfriend back home on a payphone and told her about it, she was, for some reason, pissed off at me. Remember payphones? Shit. I probably walked around Europe buying phone cards so I could call home. That's how old I am. I also visited, that first time, a small round plaza where a bunch of women were tatting. My dad knew the word, I didn't. Tatting is making lace by hand using small wooden shuttles. It's a big thing in Valencia, apparently. Look up encaje de bolillos if you want. After that, I came out here for one reason or another every few years or so. One time, I ate rabbit paella on that same round plaza, or round square, perhaps. Another time, a friend and I went to the mostly deserted beach at El Saler, where we spent the night in sleeping bags on the sand. Beach camping in Spain is probably illegal or something. Do your research first. Don't do it just because you saw it on this blog. I remember coming here once and realizing that Valencia was a few years ahead of Madrid in the great conversion to hipsterdom that went through European cities back in the 2010s. Suddenly, every restaurant had a lot of decor and a quirky concept, silly names on the menu, the whole bit. The fact is, it was always a bit more touristy than Madrid, but I've always loved it. Now, fresh off the route of Don Quixote, I'm back. Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 78, all about my recent trip to Valencia. The route of Don Quixote is a couple of episodes ago if you want to listen to that. It's a bike tour I did around La Mancha down in the south of Spain. Well, maybe not the south of Spain, but at least south of Madrid. Now that I live in the frozen north up here in Barcelona, I call a lot of things the south of Spain. La Mancha, just to the south of Madrid, that was episode 76. This is episode 78 about Valencia. Let's get to it. Years ago, when I was a real travel writer, doing restaurant reviews for Lonely Planet, I had to read the official style guide for their online publications. It had plenty of tips on how to make our reviews more inclusive and comprehensible for readers around the world, as well as lists of common clichés we should stay away from. Don't assume they're escaping a cold winter, for example. Don't use come as a preposition unless absolutely necessary. That's cum, come, which, these days is not often used as a preposition. Avoid expressions like lip-smacking, jaw-dropping, or awe-inspiring. But by far my favorite line from the style guide was, don't use Mecca unless referring to actual Mecca. Since then, I've been aching for an excuse to use the word Mecca in some article. So, here goes. Valencia has long been a mecca for paella lovers and horchata enthusiasts alike, and with its jaw-dropping architecture and history, it's a great place to escape the damp and windswept rock you call home for some warmer weather, even in the cold of winter. Getting off the slow regional train from Alcázar de San Juan, I take in the awe-inspiring beauty of the city for a minute. But I'm not my usual sprightly self. The train left too early this morning for me to find any coffee, and now it's after 11 and I'm completely uncaffeinated. Luckily, I've packed light, so I enjoy the walk across town with my backpack, stopping for coffee along the way. Valencia, once a mecca for lace makers and saffron merchants, now a mecca for uncaffeinated blogger types. But coffee is just the first step in my plan. I'm here to see the Holy Grail. Several years ago, it came to my attention that the Holy Grail is here in Valencia. Of course, there are several Holy Grails out there, but the most believable one is the one in Valencia. It's been used by 2 popes when they gave masses on their visits to the city. Later, in 2014, Pope Francis declared a Jubilee year in honor of the Grail, to be celebrated every 5 years forever. Apparently, that means that even the Vatican recognizes this one as being the true Grail, and that pilgrims visiting the chalice will receive forgiveness for all sins, plenary indulgence. The next Jubilee year starts in October 2025. Mark your calendars. The other Grails of Europe, though, well, they may be Grails, but they're not this holy. You could almost say that this Holy Grail is the Holy Grail of Holy Grails. Dropping my backpack off at the hotel, I wander down towards the cathedral. However, I find there's something of a line, and if there's one thing Mr. Chorizo tries to avoid when he's on vacation, it's line standing. I decide to come back later, and instead end up inside the neighboring Basilica de Santa Maria de los Desamparados. The ceiling on this place is amazing, one of those heavenly dome scenes with angels floating overhead. This time, I also notice a painting of the Degollamiento de los Santos Inocentes. This refers to the biblical story in which Herod the Great has all the young children of Bethlehem killed in hopes of getting rid of Jesus before he becomes a problem. Politics worked somewhat differently back then, I guess. Contemplating the scene in the basilica, I think back to the martyrs last week in Toledo, that's episode 75, and the bones of Santa Ursula, which are displayed in the cathedral there. She was also a martyr. These days, we use a lot of religious vocabulary to talk about things that are completely different than its actual meaning, I think. Heading off toward an Argentinian restaurant I've heard is a mecca for steak lovers. Stop being such a martyr. It sounds like an admonishment for someone who's whining. Actual martyrs tended to be flayed alive or burnt at the stake. Santa Eulalia, the patron of Barcelona, was allegedly rolled down the street inside a barrel full of broken glass. And famously, she didn't complain. Things like that put my lack of coffee this morning into a bit of perspective. Thinking of Saints Ursula and Eulalia, and of the Holy Grail, here's some other religious vocabulary we use to mean something else these days. They really crucified me at that meeting last Wednesday. Well, they probably didn't crucify you, per se. Crucifixion was a method of execution for a very long time in many countries. Jesus, of course, is usually painted on a T-shaped cross, but sometimes the cross is X-shaped. St. Peter, according to biblical apocrypha, was crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy of dying in the same way as Jesus. More about the apocrypha in a few minutes. For now, did you know that crucifixion is still a thing in Sharia law? Saudi Arabia is apparently still crucifying people, usually beheading them first. The crucifixion is meant to display their bodies, not to kill them. And even today in the Philippines, some people crucify themselves non-lethally as a devotional practice on Good Friday. An article on Wikipedia, the crucifixion article on Wikipedia, reports that Rolando del Campo, a carpenter in Pampanga, vowed to be crucified every Good Friday for 15 years if God would carry his wife through a difficult childbirth. If that's not love, I don't know what is. But let's talk about San Francisco's crusade against sugary beverages. Today, we use the word crusade to mean an extended campaign against something considered to be bad. The actual crusades, of course, were religious wars starting about 1,000 years ago. The First Crusade was an attempt to take the Holy Land back from the Islamic Seljuk Empire that was, in those days, making life difficult for Christian populations and pilgrims. Jerusalem was taken in 1099 after a 5-week siege. Official crusades were approved by the Pope, but there were popular crusades also. The official ones involved knights, the popular ones were more spontaneous. And the Reconquista here in Spain was also a conflict between the Visigoth kingdoms and the Muslim occupation, but it's not generally referred to as a crusade. In writing nearly 5,000 words about Don Quixote a couple of weeks ago, I didn't get around to researching knighthood in Europe at all, but I get the idea that knights would, among other things, protect groups of Christians around Europe. For example, pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago. But let's talk instead about sinful chocolate cheesecake. Because back when I was a bag boy at AJ's Fine Foods in the desert wasteland outside Phoenix, Arizona, there was a cashier named Joe who would flirt with the customers by saying stupid shit like, "Those cupcakes look decadent," or "That cheesecake looks sinful." He'd kind of giggle as he said it. Gluttony, of course, is one of the 7 deadly sins, and its opposite, temperance, one of the Stoic virtues. Presumably, gluttony is what we mean when referring to cheesecake as being sinful. On the other hand, through online searching, I now discover that there are guilt-free cheesecakes as well. Seems like a lot of moral pressure to put on your cheesecake either way. What decadence has to do with desserts, I have yet to discover, but let's move on to Star Wars canon and Led Zeppelin apocrypha. In the biblical sense, canon refers to the texts that are officially included in the Bible. If a religious text from around that time period has been examined and determined not to be canon, it's apocryphal. So, for example, the Catholic Church, at the Council of Rome in the year 382 AD, drew up a list of 73 documents that now form the Catholic Bible, 46 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. Those are the Catholic canon, the real deal Word of God. Your denomination may have a slightly different list of texts. In geek fandom, they use the word canon to mean something fairly similar. Rick and Morty canon refers to the main plot line of what really happens within their fictional universe. An episode that takes place inside a video game might contain plenty of silly events that aren't canon in the sense that they didn't happen in the fictional universe. They happened in a video game inside that universe, and they won't have further consequences in the story. Similarly, you could write Star Wars fan fiction in which Princess Leia and Jabba the Hutt are unhappily married, living in the suburbs and arguing while standing in line at the space Walmart. But it wouldn't be canon. I've also seen apocryphal used to refer to stories about famous people that aren't true. For example, the possibly apocryphal story of various members of Led Zeppelin using a fish to sexually pleasure a red-haired groupie. That's the famous mud shark incident. I don't know if it happened or not, and it is therefore possibly apocryphal. I could go on here, but let's just say that the steak at the Argentinian restaurant was good, but not ambrosial, and that while Valencia is a very nice place, I would hesitate to call it a Mediterranean paradise. In any case, it has recently been named the #1 city for expats, as well as one of the healthiest cities in the world. And then, of course, there's the paella. Spanish people go absolutely apeshit if you suggest, as a foreigner, that you know anything at all about paella, so I'll just say here that while I'm happy to eat it about once a year, paella is far from being my favorite rice dish. In fact, I'd prefer to get a shrimp fried rice from a good Chinese restaurant any day. Shrimp fried rice is better than paella. They're gonna crucify me for that one. Let's talk several fun facts about Valencia. Because after lunch, I decide to leave my visit to the cathedral and the Holy Grail for the next day, and instead decide to spend the afternoon wandering around Barrio del Carmen. Here's a fun fact about Valencia that I only learned today. The Borgia family of popes were from right down the road in Xàtiva. That means that they were Valencian and, therefore, canonically, Catalan. It's weird that the Catalans don't go around trumpeting the fact that one of the allegedly most evil families in history is one of their own. A cultural note, the Valencians are usually happy to be Spanish, but the Catalans like to expand the definition of Catalonia to include all sorts of people who want nothing to do with their independence movement. Also, the Valencian language is very similar to Catalan. Some would say they're variants of the same language. It depends on who you ask. In any case, the Borgia Palace here in Valencia is closed until Monday, and that's a bummer. But it gives me a reason to come back soon, and to plan a visit to Xàtiva. The Borgias are ancient history, though. More recently, Valencia is famous for the Fallas Festival, in which giant effigies are set on fire in the streets, and the Ciudad de Artes y Ciencias, a museum complex designed by Santiago Calatrava. It has a pretty good aquarium as well. If you're into wacky festivals, the nearby town of Buñol has one in which people spend a day throwing tomatoes at each other. It's in late August and it's called La Tomatina. I think you need to buy tickets in advance. And that's about as much info as you're likely to get from a list of facts about Valencia online. It's better to just experience it, go there and walk around. It's beautiful. The next day I'm up early as usual, and while sitting in the one open coffee place, it occurs to me that the cathedral might be open for Mass in the morning. I Google, and it is. Free entrance until about 9:30, it looks like. The Grail is in a chapel off to the side. It's a small red stone cup with a golden base with handles that was added centuries later. Archaeologists have looked at it and have actually decided that it's old enough to have come from the Last Supper. In fact, it's from that area and it's from the period of Herod the Great, who I mentioned earlier massacring all the babies in Bethlehem. So this Grail is, at least plausibly, old enough to have been used at the Last Supper. I'm in the little chapel containing the Grail when a couple of priests walk in and close the door behind them. Before I know it, the dozen people in the pews are on their feet and we're doing Mass. Guess I'll be here for a while. I sit down after the first blessing. The priest lifts his head and looks at me over his glasses, and I glance around. Oops, I'm the only one sitting. I get back up. I don't go to Mass very often, and I've forgotten some of the protocol. Yo confieso ante Dios Todopoderoso y ante ustedes hermanos que he pecado mucho de pensamiento, palabra, obra y omisión. Por mi culpa, por mi culpa, por mi gran culpa, por mi culpa, por mi culpa, por mi gran culpa. He repeats the por mi culpa, por mi culpa, por mi gran culpa part several more times. It's interesting how this is pretty much the exact opposite of the message you get casually scrolling through Instagram. Humility isn't popular these days, nor is a sense of duty to something higher than your own desires. In case you don't speak Spanish, let me just translate that last bit. I confess before all-powerful gods and before you, my brothers, that I have sinned very much in thought, in word, in deed, and in omission. And the last part, por mi culpa, por mi culpa, por mi gran culpa, is just the mea culpa part. I was wrong, it's my fault. I'm sure there's a specific translation of this into English. I don't know exactly what it is because I don't go to Mass very often. Anyway, the priest talks about Our Lady of the Forsaken, that's La Virgen de los Desamparados, whose basilica I visited yesterday, the one with the dome full of angels. Our Lady of the Forsaken is the Virgin who protects the weak and needy, the homeless and the addicts, the people with nowhere to go. In any case, the message of the sermon is of hope and peace and brotherhood. After a while, they pass the collection basket. I barely ever carry change anymore, but I dig into my pockets. Nothing. The basket passes me, and I see there's only €1 and a few copper coins in it. The part of the sign of peace comes, and I stick out my hand to the guy who's next to me. He gives me a funny look. Okay, nobody else is shaking hands either. But after a moment's hesitation, he takes my hand. He's a skinny guy in a denim jacket, and he's looking a bit desamparado himself, like he's maybe had a few really rough decades. I can't do the bread and wine bit. As an unbaptized heathen and occasional elephant worshiper, I'm not supposed to take communion. But I've sort of changed my mind about religion over the last few years. Or, at the very least, I've decided that the current culture of hedonism and self-aggrandizement is a total dead end. I walk out feeling lighter, spiritually lighter. Also, Mass in the chapel of the Holy Chalice. How cool is that? It's pretty much the Holy Grail of Holy Grail experiences, if you ask me. Back outside, it's a sunny Saturday morning in Valencia. Most people writing about Spain focus on the fun in the sun aspects. They make it seem like the whole country is fully occupied with drinking sangria at the beach or hanging out at rooftop bars. But I've been in Spain almost 20 years now, like I said, and I've been writing about it for more than a decade. I was never much fun to begin with, and I'm no longer interested in making lists of the top 9 authentic paella restaurants or whatever. Hopefully you're with me on this journey through some of the deeper aspects of Spanish culture. My last stop in Valencia is the Museum of Fine Arts. I remember seeing this building on my first trip as well. The distinctive blue-tiled dome just across the riverbed from downtown. Speaking of chalices, there's a painting of Jesus bleeding out into a large cup held by one of his followers. There's St. George, his spear buried in the mouth of the dragon, and there's a skull, reminding us of our final end. The inscription below the skull is in Latin. The translation is, "In all thy works remember thy last end, and thou shalt never sin." This is apparently a quote from the book of Ecclesiasticus, aka Sirach, chapter 7, a book that's included in the Catholic Bible and most Orthodox Bibles, but not the Protestant version. It is, therefore, both canon and apocryphal, depending on which version of Christianity you're following. One steak lunch and one coffee later, I'm on the train back up the coast towards Barcelona. That's all I've got for today. I hope you had a good time listening here. I've got another circular saw outside the house today, so I had to do some pausing here. So hopefully I got all of the noise out of this episode and you can just listen to my deep, relaxing voice. As usual, let me know if there are any topics you would like to see here on the blog. I'm happy to hear from you. You can donate expatmadrid.com/donate. And while you're donating me some money to buy a virtual coffee, you can send me a note saying what you would like to see. I'm not probably going to write about best rooftop bars or anything, but I've got a new article on the way about Poblano neighborhood, which everybody is referring to as the coolest neighborhood in Barcelona. I don't know if I would go that far, but we'll see where the writing takes me. expatmadrid.com/donate to send a donation. You can go to expatmadrid.com to read the blog. There's a contact form there where you can also get in touch. I really wanted to work the Holy Prepuce into this article, but in the end I didn't manage it. In any case, several churches around Europe used to contain relics of what was allegedly Jesus' foreskin. Some denominations still celebrate the Feast of the Circumcision on January 1st of each year. Stories about the origin of the holy prepuce being first laid out in the apocryphal Syriac Infancy Gospel. By now, all known foreskin relics have been lost or stolen, unfortunately, and now you know more than you ever thought you would need about the holy foreskin. Have a great day wherever you are. Like this podcast, please. Subscribe. Leave me a review on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts. Whatever you do to support is great. I appreciate it all very much. And thanks, as always, for listening. Hasta la próxima. Bye.